The Divine Life is the title of a book that I'm looking at, and a special guest that we have with us today, AT Mann. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
You are a treasure of knowledge, of cosmos, of human DNA, of our reincarnation. Where do I begin? Tell us about your background.
I was trained as an architect in the 60s at Cornell University, and I practiced architecture in the late 60s. And I began spending time in Europe, actually, while I was still in school and then afterwards. And I loved architecture, but it turns out that I became more and more interested in time rather than space. And the buildings that I designed were utilizing proportion systems, and it always intrigued me that certain proportion spaces evoked very particular emotional, mental states, even spiritual states. And when I started traveling in Europe, I began realizing also, upon visiting what I considered to be sacred places, that something was going on that wasn't evident, it wasn't obvious to me, and it certainly wasn't something that I came across in architecture school. So I began exploring time, and this took many forms. Part of it was spending a lot of time in very so-called primitive cultures, like really going back to the earth. Remember, it was the time of hippies and things like that, and I was, imbibing certain substances that really allowed me to take a look at the role my mind was playing in, the way I saw my world, and I realized that it was undergoing a huge change.
You said sacred spaces. Tell us about that.
Sacred space to me, and again, one of my most recent books published 4 years ago is called Sacred Landscapes. And the idea is that there are certain places, in fact, the subtitle was, it was Sacred Landscapes, the Threshold Between Worlds. And the idea is that when you encounter a sacred space, a place that either has been sacred to earlier people, very typically they've probably been sacred or considered sacred to a succession of people who occupy that land. But what happens when you are around a sacred space or experience one is that it's like you cross a boundary into a different awareness. And once that happens to you, it almost becomes a bit addictive in the sense that you want to experience more places like this, because it really does often, to me, feel like contacting a kind of inner direction somehow.
Is that architecturally structured, or?
Not necessarily, because the word sacred probably rarely came about in my entire career as an architect. And I feel, actually, I stopped doing architecture in the late 60s, early 70s. I feel like I've learned much more about architecture in the years since I stopped it than I did during the years when I did it. And just simply because I began realizing that our life existed in time, and very much like looking at a building relative to your movement through it, and what that feels like and what it evokes. It's like when you go into a place like Chartres Cathedral, you go through a relatively small entrance and you explode into this vertical space with amazing rose windows, things like this. And
so the divine life is that how you see sacredness, not just in space, but in landscape, in the ability of the human creativity in making all these other structures, and what also nature alone can give us.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because upon being interested in time, I began reading a lot about it and exploring a lot of it, because it felt like a lot of the experiences I had with kind of alternative substances in those days really altered my perception of time.
Tell us about these alternative substances.
I am, in the sense that I can't tell you everything at once. That
We want it all.
things unfold in time, and and what happened was that I had a horoscope done in 1970 in New York. It was like a computer done one. I didn't particularly think it looked very interesting. It was very primitive technology, and certainly the interpretation was so useless that I chucked it away. But it was something that really stayed with me. I began thinking about it, and and it was interesting because to me, the people that were interested in it that I met weren't very convincing. And then I went through a period of years where I'd made some money in New York and bought some land with friends and sold it, and sold a loft in New York that we built. And what happened was that I began living in these places, in foreign places like Morocco and India, and traveling on foot often through places like Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and so on, that I began realizing I really needed to explore this and study it, and also the experiences I had.
So the cultures intrigued you.
Yeah,
And
because
it was like a code of understanding that how they each represented a separation and yet a dynamic of a whole.
yeah, I don't know whether I would phrase it that way, but it was like going back in time. In fact, I described this journey in Sacred Landscapes. And I was just saying that leaving Europe, and especially going through Bulgaria on the way, going through Bulgaria was like going back to the 1930s, the 1940s, and then you go from there into Turkey, which is taking you back into the 1700s or 1800s, and Iran, at the time, was a very strange contrast, in the sense that once you're out in the countryside of Iran, it's like it could be 1,000 years ago, and yet Tehran is, quite civilized in many ways. But it was very interesting because it was a time travel, and I had certain experiences that.
What year was this?
1970.
So you were still under the Shah.
Yeah, it was an unusual time because a lot of people were seeking, and. It's interesting, as a friend of mine remarked recently, nowadays there are gurus and teachers and so on everywhere, but back in those days we were really pioneers in the sense that we were taking substances with no guidance. We had no one to ask about what it meant and how it worked and what went on with it. And among the people that I met on my journeys and people that I knew in general, to a large extent I went a lot further than anyone else I knew. And I encountered territory in me that made me really wonder what it was about, where it was coming from, what its real essence was. And so
it helped you expand.
Well, I set myself a task that I wanted to find out what went on. And so I probably pushed those experiences way over the edge. And I actually did quite literally go over the edge in India. I had an experience where I experienced in one evening, in a sense, experiencing a succession of lives, but highly compacted in time. In fact, 7 different circumstances that, again, each one, not that they lasted a lifetime, because they didn't, but it was like a highly accelerated process of moving through dimensions and experiencing things that had very high symbolic quality. And in a way, I'm quite lucky because even from the late 60s, I've kept diaries, which means that now those diaries are coming close to 50 years of them. And they exist in about 40 volumes of books.
So you have your biography already done. All the notes are there.
Well, I kept notes of these experiences because I know how fleeting they are. It's like a dream. It's like you experience something that when you're in it is so vivid, and it's like a real aha moment, but then suddenly the next day your memory of it kind of gets fainter and fainter and fainter. But I'm lucky because I can even evoke some of those experiences because, the period of time when I was in Morocco, I was living with a German actress who later was in a lot of Fassbinder's films, the famous German director in the late 70s and early 80s. And, and I was exploring territory which was unusual because I did not know anyone, and I knew a lot of people at that point in New York and so on, but I didn't know anyone who had gone to the same place and in the same way. And when I discovered astrology, I was just playing with it in the beginning, and I began feeling that this is something I should really find out about.
So from architecture and the sacred space, sacred landscape, and time, and going through all these cultures and all that, the only thing that could now really intrigue you as a profession was astrology.